Ivy Kwan was never supposed to be remembered. That was the unspoken rule of her position. The senior financial manager of the Fairmont Pacific Rim's private events tier existed to make other people's evenings run flawlessly, and then to disappear. She was the math behind the magic, the woman who signed off on the six-figure bar tabs, reconciled the vendor invoices at midnight, and ensured every crystal glass was polished to the precise reflective standard the hotel demanded. She managed the invisible machinery that made moments look effortless for people who had never once considered how their effortlessness was manufactured. Tonight, the private dining suite on the 10th floor belonged to Aris Karas. Ivy had read his file before the shift. The hotel kept private security profiles on all VIP bookings, which Karas's evening had cleared by a factor of 6. Aris Karas, 42 years old. Born in Vancouver to a Greek-Canadian family with deep roots in Kitsilano. On paper, real estate developer, commercial property group, 15 office towers across British Columbia and 2 in Toronto. Off paper, and the file had been notably thinner on that side. There were associations, import-export arrangements, a name that appeared in sealed court documents without ever being charged, a face that certain Vancouver Police Department detectives apparently recognized on sight. The general manager had pulled Ivy into his office at 6 that evening, pale under his careful tan. "Miss Kwan, tonight's private function. Do not speak unless addressed. Do not ask questions about anything you hear. Whatever they want, provide it immediately." Ivy had nodded once and gone to prepare the suite. Now she stood in the dimly lit service alcove off the east wall, her clipboard pressed flat against her side, watching the room from her carefully calculated position of maximum invisibility. The suite was extraordinary, even by this hotel's standards, 3 walls of floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the black expanse of Burrard Inlet, the North Shore Mountains invisible behind October cloud cover, the lights of West Vancouver scattered like fallen stars along the waterline. The long, lacquered dining table held only a Glenfarclas 1968 and 6 heavy crystal tumblers. No food, ashtrays of polished onyx. 6 men. 5 of them she could categorize immediately, 2 flanking the door in expensive suits cut for men who needed room across the shoulders, 2 more seated mid-table with the stillness of people accustomed to waiting, and 1 man, Bart Chung. She had matched the face to the reservation roster, sitting across from the head of the table with the particular stillness of a man trying very hard not to visibly panic. At the head of the table sat Aris Karas. Ivy had expected powerful. She had not expected this. He was broad-shouldered and unhurried in a way that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with control. The control of a man who had never once needed to fill silence with noise. His suit was charcoal wool, made for him rather than adjusted to fit. His hands, wrapped around his untouched tumbler, were scarred across the knuckles in the specific way that did not come from a gym. His face was all Greek angles, weathered rather than aged, the jaw of someone who had grown up working with his hands before he learned to work with his mind. He had not looked at Ivy once since she entered the room. She preferred it that way. "The Richmond lot," Bart was saying, his voice tight with controlled desperation. "The shipping manifest was clean, Aris. I saw it personally. The cold storage on number 5 road, everything logged, everything accounted for." Aris swirled his whiskey without drinking it. "Clean manifests," he said, his voice low enough that Ivy had to concentrate to catch it. "And yet $3.4 million of my money evaporated between the warehouse gate and the trucks. Cleanly. I don't know how." Boho Jindak. Ivy's hand tightened on her clipboard. Aris had not raised his voice. He had simply switched languages, seamlessly, without signaling the shift, the way a person does when they stop performing and start speaking. It wasn't Cantonese the way a language app taught it, or the soft Mandarin-inflected variety of the business districts. It was the Cantonese of wet markets and crowded stairwells, of Saturday morning dim sum tables with 12 people and not enough chairs. The street Cantonese of Kowloon, of Mong Kok, of Ivy's grandmother's kitchen in East Van, where the radio always played canto pop, and the scoldings came hard and fast in that exact dialect. He doesn't know you understand that, Ivy told herself, her face a careful blank. You are a clipboard, you are furniture, you are a number on a spreadsheet. Aris leaned back, addressing the man to his right in the same rolling cadence. Bart is going to tell us where the money went, or he is going to explain the situation to the inlet at 4 in the morning. Which do you think he prefers? The man to Aris's right, Nikos, heavyset and quiet, with the tired eyes of someone who had stopped finding any of this surprising, gave a small shrug. He prefers option 1. He doesn't look like a strong swimmer. No, Aris agreed. He switched back to English without pause. Bart, try the truth. It's the option that keeps you warm. Bart Ching put his hands flat on the table. Ivy could see them shaking from 12 feet away. She needed to leave this room. She needed the next 20 minutes to pass without incident. She needed it to be 10 p.m. so she could hand the suite close up to the night porter and drive back to her apartment in Mount Pleasant and not think about any of this. Then her phone buzzed. The override line. Only one emergency tier could trigger it at this hour, a Category 1 vendor failure on an active booking. Tomorrow's event, the Vancouver Real Estate Summit Gala, 600 attendees. Ivy had been coordinating it for 7 months. She had personally sourced 30 pounds of Dungeness crab, 200 oysters, imported BC spot prawns for the raw bar, and central to the whole culinary concept, 400 pounds of live Haida Gwaii crab from Benny Fong's import operation, arriving at the loading dock at 5:30 a.m. Everyone at the table looked toward the sound. Ivy kept her voice very steady. I apologize, gentlemen. A critical vendor issue for tomorrow's function. I'll step outside. Stay. Aris's voice was quiet and final. Handle it here. Keep your voice down. He didn't trust her out of his sight. Not now. Not with Bart's composure visibly disintegrating. Ivy nodded, turned her back to the room, and pressed as far into the service alcove as the narrow space allowed. She pulled the phone from her blazer pocket and answered in a low, controlled whisper. Ivy Kwan. Miss Kwan. Benny Fong's voice was expansive and unbothered, the specific tone of a man who knew he had leverage at the worst possible moment. I have some unfortunate news about tomorrow's delivery. A storage complication. My costs have increased significantly. The shipment cannot proceed unless the hotel authorizes an additional $45,000 by midnight. Wire transfer. $45,000 at 9:47 p.m. on a Friday. Ivy closed her eyes and breathed through her nose. She had planned this gala the way she planned everything. Precisely, relentlessly, with no margin for last-minute extortion. The seafood service was the architectural centerpiece of the reception. Without it, the whole menu collapsed. The event's sponsoring CEO, who had personally approved every single canapé during 3 separate tastings, would notice. The hotel would be sued. Ivy would be fired. Benny, she said, keeping her voice low and professional, we have a signed contract. The delivery terms are fixed. Contracts, Benny said pleasantly. Paper. The trucks don't move without the money. You understand, Miss Kwan, nothing personal. He said it the way people do when they absolutely mean it personally. Something in Ivy Kwan went quiet in the particular way that precedes a storm. It was not a dramatic shift. It was a small, internal pivot. The moment when the part of her that had spent 30 years being polite and careful and professionally invisible was simply overridden by the part of her that had grown up in a 3-bedroom house in East Van with 2 aunts, a grandmother, and a grandfather who had run a Chinatown restaurant for 31 years, and never once in those 31 years let anyone take a cent from him that wasn't earned. The corporate manager stepped aside. Her grandmother's granddaughter took the phone. 你以為你玩得過我係咩? It's in the exact cadence of the Kowloon Street Cantonese that made grown men step back, involuntarily. You think you can 係同我講嘢? 唔係同啲傻仔講? You're talking to me now, not some fool who doesn't know your operation. 我份合約係合法嘅，你唔交貨，我會曲號。全城每一個菜靠步都知你係邊個，你做過咩事。I will make sure every procurement manager in this city knows your name and exactly what you did with it. At the dining table behind her, the soft clink of crystal against lacquer stopped entirely. Ivy didn't notice. The adrenaline was doing something industrial to her ability to read the room. 到聽朝5:30分，你架車係停喺落貨區度，唔係就你自己顧後果，明唔明？ Your trucks will be at my loading dock at 5:30, or you will deal with the consequences yourself. Do you understand me? There was a long silence from Benny's end, then very quietly, Yes, understood. How, Ming-to-Chin, good, tomorrow morning. She hung up. The suite was so quiet she could hear the ventilation system. Ivy turned around slowly. Aris Karas was sitting upright in his chair, not leaning, not swirling his whiskey. Completely still, the way a person goes still when they have just heard something that reorganizes what they thought they knew. His eyes were on her, not past her, not through her, but on her with the full, focused weight of a man whose attention, she suspected, had the density of something structural. Bart Ching had stopped visibly panicking. Nikos's expression had shifted into something that wasn't quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. Even the men by the door had altered their posture without appearing to move. Is there an issue with tomorrow's service, Miss Kwan? Aris asked. His voice was perfectly even. No, sir, Ivy said. Her voice was remarkably steady, given that every internal alarm she possessed was sounding at full volume. It's been handled. He looked at her for 5 complete seconds. Then the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. Something more complicated than that. I can see that, he said. He glanced at Nikos. Something passed between them without words. Then Aris rose from his chair, buttoning his jacket with the calm efficiency of a man, concluding a quarterly review rather than a death consultation. We're done for the evening. Bart, the car. We'll continue this conversation somewhere quieter. Bart made a sound that was not quite a word. Ivy moved immediately to the service station, reaching for the cleared table protocol on autopilot. Stack the tumblers, cover the decanter, call the night porter. Leave it. Aris's voice stopped her without being raised. He was at the doorway, overcoat in hand, and he was looking at her again with that same structural attention. Have a safe evening, Miss Kwan. She got to the staff locker room on sheer nerve alone. Once the heavy door clicked shut behind her, she pressed her back against the metal and breathed for 15 seconds without moving. They heard you. Every word. In the dialect that told them exactly where she'd grown up, exactly whose kitchen she'd learned it in, and exactly what it meant that she had understood their private conversation for the past 45 minutes. You did not survive listening to a man quietly order an execution by accident. You survived it by being nobody worth remembering afterward. She had spent the entire evening meticulously being nobody, and then she had screamed in fluent Hmong Kok Cantonese directly in front of 6 men, one of whom had been conducting business in that exact dialect all night. She changed out of her blazer in under 3 minutes, coat on, bag over her shoulder, staff exit to B2. The underground parkade smelled of rain-wet concrete and salt air, the particular damp of a Vancouver October that crept into every structure near the water. Her Civic was parked in the northeast corner. She was halfway across the open bay, keys already out when she heard footsteps. Hard soles on concrete, deliberate, not hurrying. Ivy pressed the unlock fob. The Civic's headlights flashed once in the dark. She covered the last 20 feet at something just short of a run, grabbed the door handle. A hand came flat against the window from behind, not violent, just final. She spun, pressing her back against the cold metal of the car door. Nikos stood in front of her. Dino, the taller one from the door, had materialized from behind a concrete pillar to her left, cutting off the exit ramp with the unhurried precision of a man who had done this before. Miss Kwan, Nikos said, not unkindly, leaving in a hurry. My shift ended 10 minutes ago. She kept her voice level. She squared her shoulders and took up the full width of the space she occupied, refusing to make herself smaller than she was. Please move. In a moment, said a voice from the shadows at the back of the parkade. Aris Karas stepped into the pale wash of the overhead fluorescent lamp. He had shed his overcoat. In the cold underground air, in his suit and the particular stillness that seemed to be his default state, he looked like something carved rather than born. The scar along his jaw was more visible here. His dark eyes were direct and entirely calm. "You speak Cantonese," he said. Not an accusation, an observation, the way a geologist notes an unexpected formation. "My family is from East Van," Ivy said. Her heart was doing something alarming. "My grandmother was Mong Kok. I grew up in the language. That's all this is." Whatever was discussed in that room this evening, I have absolutely no interest in your affairs, and I will not say a word to anyone. "I know you won't," Aris said. He walked toward her, unhurried, and Nikos and Dino stepped back without being instructed. A choreography of deference she noted even through her fear. He stopped 3 feet from her. His eyes moved across her face in the unhurried way of a man not accustomed to having to look twice at anything. Then, more deliberately, they moved lower, taking in the full, real shape of her in her winter coat, the soft curve of her hips, the unashamed weight of her standing her ground on the concrete, and he was not looking at her the way she had braced to be looked at. He was looking at her the way people look at something that surprises them in the best possible way. "But there is a problem." "There is no problem," Ivy said. "I overheard a private conversation. People do that. I am a hotel employee with an unblemished 7-year record and a gala to run in 6 hours. The problem," Aris said, "is that I have spent 3 years in rooms full of people who perform competence for my benefit. And tonight I watched a woman in a hotel blazer receive a call from a man attempting to extort her and dismantle him so completely he thanked her at the end." A pause that held something she couldn't name. "In the street dialect of a neighborhood I know better than he does." Ivy opened her mouth, closed it. "I have no intention of letting you leave," Aris said, with the same tone one might use to discuss a schedule adjustment, "until we've had a proper conversation." Nikos opened the rear door of a black SUV idling 20 feet away that Ivy had not heard arrive. The interior was black leather and profound quiet. Ivy pressed herself against the far window. The locks engaged. Aris settled beside her, close enough that she could smell expensive cedar and something older underneath it, like cold salt water, and opened a narrow wood compartment between the seats, extracting a crystal decanter and a single glass. "I'm not drinking anything you pour me," Ivy said. "It's a 30-year Talisker." He held the glass out without looking at her. "I wouldn't waste it." She took the glass. Her fingers shook slightly. The whiskey was extraordinary, and she hated how clearly she noticed. "Where are you taking me?" she said. "My building. Coal Harbor." He leaned back and looked at her with that complete, unsettling attention. "You're being placed under protection for the next 24 hours. Bart has people who will be unhappy by morning. A witness in that room is a liability they won't choose to ignore." "I need to be at the hotel at 5 a.m., Ivy said. "I have 600 attendees, a raw bar installation, an ice sculpture delivery, and a keynote speaker who has already sent me 14 emails about the table arrangement." "The gala can." "The gala cannot," Ivy said, and something in her voice stopped him cold. "I have spent 7 months on this event. The seafood service alone required 11 vendor negotiations and a sourcing trip to Haida Gwaii. If I'm not at those loading dock doors at 5 a.m., it collapses. The hotel gets sued, I get fired, and Benny Fong arrives with 400 pounds of crab that nobody is there to sign for." A silence stretched through the moving vehicle. "Benny Fong," Aris said slowly. "The seafood importer." "Yes." Ivy put the glass down. Something cold and clear was rising through the adrenaline, the specific sensation that happened when her brain connected data points she hadn't consciously known she was assembling. He operates refrigerated trucks out of a cold storage facility on number 5 Road in Richmond. Aris said nothing, but the quality of his attention had changed entirely. Bart said, the money vanished between the warehouse gate and the trucks. The cold storage on number 5 Road. Ivy pressed her fingertips together, thinking out loud. Benny's operation runs haulback routes. His trucks make city deliveries and return to Richmond empty. Or they're supposed to return empty. She looked directly at Aris. Refrigerated cargo containers. CFIA inspection checks for food safety compliance, not cash. If someone was loading the return hauls with shrink-wrapped bills packed between insulation panels, she stopped. Bart didn't lose your money. He moved it, using Benny's trucks as a mobile vault, and those trucks are scheduled to be at my loading dock at 5:30 tomorrow morning. The SUV was very quiet. If I don't show up, Ivy continued, Benny will know something went wrong. He'll reroute. You'll lose it again. But if you let me run my gala. Aris Karas stared at her for a long moment. In the front seat, Nikos had gone entirely still. You worked that out, Aris said, in under a minute. I manage vendor logistics for a living, Ivy said. This is just logistics. He said nothing for another breath. Then he turned to look out the rain-streaked window at the lights along the seawall, and she watched the angle of his jaw in the passing glow of street lamps, and some expression moved across his face that she couldn't fully read. Nikos, he said quietly. Yeah, boss. Get your suit pressed. The Vancouver Real Estate Summit Gala transformed the Fairmont's Grand Ballroom into something that required approximately 400 hours of prior invisible work to look effortless, and at 7:15 a.m. Ivy Kwan was conducting every one of those invisible hours simultaneously. The east floral bank is 6 inches too far left. I can see the speaker's entrance from that sightline, and it reads like a garden center. Move it now, please. She never raised her voice when she was working. She didn't need to. The sommelier station goes against the north pillar, not the east. If it's against the east wall, the traffic flow from registration creates a bottleneck at the greeting line, and we'll have a pile-up by 6 p.m. I won't be explaining that to the sponsoring CEO. Staff scattered. From 20 feet away, leaning against a marble pillar with his arms crossed and his coffee untouched, Aris Karas watched her. He had not left the hotel. While Nikos and Dino repositioned themselves at the loading dock, Aris had stayed. In his suit, with the quiet lethality that seemed to emanate from him at a constant low frequency, he watched Ivy work with an expression that Nikos, glancing back as he left, would have recognized immediately as something his boss had not worn in a very long time. She was remarkable in motion. Not because she was beautiful in the conventional way of the women who typically occupied rooms Aris moved through, but because she was completely unperformatively herself. Every decision landed. Every correction was exact. She moved through the ballroom with the authority of someone who had built this space conceptually long before it existed physically, and was simply confirming that reality had done its job correctly. When she put her hands on her wide hips in concentrated frustration over a misaligned centerpiece, something happened to Aris's composure that he noted with something approaching alarm. Loading dock, Nikos said through his earpiece. Fong's trucks just pulled in. Benny Fong was a compact man in an expensive but wrong-season linen jacket, and he was in the middle of berating the receiving clerk when Ivy's heels clicked onto the loading dock concrete. Miss Kwan. His face arranged itself into the expression of a man who had prepared for this meeting and was confident in his position. We should discuss the revised invoice before any crates are unloaded. Open the trucks, Benny. Ivy said it in Cantonese, the same voice she'd used the night before. No preamble, no waiver. Benny's gaze went past her. The color left his face, with the completeness of a tide going out. Aris Karas stood 2 steps behind Ivy's left shoulder, hands in his pockets, expression neutral. Nikos was visible at the dock ramp. Dino had positioned himself casually in front of the only other exit. "Mr. Karas," Benny started. "Miss Kwan is speaking," Aris said pleasantly. Benny opened the trucks. The first 2/3 of the cargo was legitimate: live crab in aerated tanks, ice-packed oysters, trays of spot prawns, all of it exactly as contracted, smelling of cold ocean water and the Pacific coast. Ivy walked past it without stopping. In the rear third, behind a false panel of insulation board that was 1/2 centimeter thicker than CFIA standard specification, she had reviewed those specifications as part of her initial vendor due diligence, because that was the kind of thing she did, were 10 waterproof duffel bags arranged in 2 careful rows. Nikos pulled one open. Under the overhead dock lights, the stacked and bound bills were the flat, factual color of money. Aris stood at the rear of the truck and looked at the bags. Then he turned and looked at Ivy. The expression on his face was the one she'd glimpsed in the SUV, that combination of pride and shock, and something else she didn't have a name for yet. "The crab tanks," Ivy said. She was shivering slightly in the raw October air of the loading dock. "The oysters and the spot prawns, I need them. The reception service starts at 6 p.m. and the shellfish quality degrades if they're not refrigerated within the hour." Aris blinked. Then he laughed. It came out of him without warning. A real laugh, full and completely unguarded. The laugh of a man who had not laughed like that in a very long time. It bounced off the concrete walls of the loading dock and for a moment made the cold morning air feel different. "Take them," he said, still laughing. "Nikos, make sure the shellfish gets to the kitchen." "And Benny?" Nikos asked. The laugh faded. "Benny and I have a conversation scheduled." A pause, after Miss Kwan's crab is properly stored. By 9:30 that evening, the Vancouver Real Estate Summit Gala had become the kind of success that generated its own mythology. The raw bar service was described by 3 separate guests as the finest shellfish they had encountered anywhere in Canada. The CEO sent a message to Ivy's supervisor using the word transcendent, which Ivy privately found excessive for a catering operation, but not inaccurate. She stood in the velvet archway of the ballroom at 9:47 p.m. The hour she always allowed herself one still moment when the numbers stabilized and the evening ran on its own momentum, and felt the particular satisfaction of 7 months of invisible work made visible and then invisible again, the way the best event management always did. Her feet were in genuine agony. The undergirding of her shapewear had been a quiet ongoing argument with her rib cage for the past 4 hours. Her hair was coming out of its arrangement in small, mutinous pieces. She was also acutely aware, in the peripheral way she'd been aware all evening, of exactly where Aris Karas was standing. He had stayed. Through the setup and the registration crush, through the speeches and the dinner service and the jazz quartet that replaced the string ensemble at 9 o'clock. He'd moved through the room the way he moved through everything, without noise, without performance. And she'd tracked him without meaning to, the way you track a weather system you know is significant. When the last major guests departed through the lobby, she felt him move close before she heard him. "It went well," he said. "It went exactly as planned," Ivy said, which was not the same thing and meant everything. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Come with me." The 42nd floor of his building in Cole Harbour looked out over the inlet, dark water, the orange shimmer of the North Shore, the invisible mountains behind cloud cover that she knew were there. The space was what she'd expected. High ceilings, concrete and glass, the specific expensive simplicity of someone who had nothing left to prove. She stood at the window with her blazer off for the first time since morning, arms folded over her chest, looking out at the city. "You can let me go home," she said. "Bart's operation is finished. Benny won't be speaking to anyone. There's nothing left that requires my being here." "I know," Aris said. He was standing 10 feet behind her, and she could see his faint reflection in the glass. "That's not why I asked you to stay." Ivy turned. He crossed the room without hurrying. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the precise line of the scar along his jaw, close enough that the cedar and salt scent of him was an actual presence in the air between them. "My whole professional life," he said, "I have been surrounded by people who become less when they believe no one important is watching. They shrink. They perform differently for different audiences." He looked at her with the same structural attention that had been unsettling her since the hotel suite the night before. "You were the same person in the parking garage as you were managing your staff this morning. You were the same person asking me for your crab back as you were dismantling Bart's scheme in 40 seconds in the back of my car." Something shifted in his voice, something that had less to do with the crime boss and more to do with whoever existed underneath that. "Do you know how rare that is?" Ivy said nothing. "I have been trying to find someone who doesn't require managing," Aris continued. "Not handling, not careful cultivation. Someone who simply functions at a level that doesn't need compensating for." His eyes dropped briefly to the full, real shape of her, the soft weight of her, the wide curve of her hips, the unapologetic space she occupied, and returned to her face without the detour being anything other than an honest acknowledgement of what he saw and wanted to keep seeing. "Society has spent considerable effort convincing women like you to take up less room. I watched you all day today. You take up exactly the right amount of room." A pause. "I find that extraordinary." "I don't know anything about your world," Ivy said quietly. "You figured out a $3.4 million money laundering operation in the back of my car using a vendor spreadsheet," Aris said. "You know exactly what you need to know. The rest." He reached out and tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear, with a gentleness that had no business existing in hands that had done what his had done. "The rest, you'll learn faster than anyone I've worked with." "What are you offering me?" Ivy said carefully. "A position with real authority, not decorative." He was direct, which she'd expected from him by now, and somehow that directness was its own kind of relief. "My financial operations are run by people who are loyal but not brilliant. You are apparently both. And you also care deeply about shellfish sourcing, which suggests you take every detail seriously, regardless of who is watching." The corner of his mouth moved. "I want someone by my side who thinks faster than the room. I don't want a trophy, Ivy. I want a partner." She held his gaze. "I'll need to think about it." "Think about it," he said. "You don't have to decide tonight." She stayed anyway. By the time the cloud cover broke after midnight, fragmentary, slow, the way Vancouver skies always cleared, reluctantly, and then all at once, Ivy Kwan was standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of a Coal Harbour apartment with a 30-year Talisker warming in her hand, watching the lights of West Vancouver scatter their reflections across the black water of the inlet. She had spent 30 years perfecting invisibility. It turned out she'd never been particularly good at it, and she had absolutely no intention of getting better.